So if you've ever been in a situation where you're trying to record a snare drum and you've got one mic on the top, one mic on the bottom, and when you put them together and you bring them into Logic, they just don't sound very powerful together and they feel like they're missing something, you're probably coming across the problem of phase cancellation. So phase cancellation is a very common problem that happens when you're trying to record the same sound source with two different mics. And what's happening there is that the sound is arriving at the mics at slightly different times. And what that means is because the two different waveforms are slightly out of phase, or one of them is say slightly ahead of the other, the peaks and the troughs of those two waveforms will clash, and when you convert something to mono, you're summing the left and right channels together. This leads to issues where the sound essentially cancels parts of each other out, which is what we call destructive interference. So if they're both perfectly in phase, they'll line up perfectly and they'll actually add together when summed in mono. But a lot of the time this doesn't happen because these mics are at different positions. So instead of reinforcing each other, these two sounds will either destructively interfere and cause a weaker signal, or completely cancel out altogether if they're completely opposite in phase. So there are three different types of interactions that can occur between two separate waveforms from the same source. So the first one is constructive interference, or when the two waves are exactly in line and perfectly in line, which doesn't really happen with two mics as they're generally different distances from each other. But if they're perfectly aligned and equal distance away from that sound source, they're going to add together as they're going to be directly in phase. And just to point out, these two tracks may sound completely fine in stereo. It's more when it comes to mono and they're summing together, that's when the issues occur. So the second instance is being completely out of phase. So this is what we're talking about before, where the peaks and the troughs align of two different waveforms. And what happens there is when they're summed together, they completely cancel out. So when you're in mono, you've got literally no sound. The sound itself disappears. And the last one is being partially out of phase. So this is the most common one that generally occurs, as both the waveforms arrive at slightly different times to each mic. And what that means is that the waves are slightly out of phase, so they're only causing some destructive interference, but not completely cancelling out. So now that you know about phase cancellation, let's talk about some common instances where this occurs. So the first one, and probably the most common one that I've come across, is multiple mics on a snare drum. So when you're recording a snare drum in a live context, you generally want to record the top of the snare and the bottom of the snare, as you can get slightly different sounds from each one. And when you blend them together, you can play around with the sound a lot more and have a lot more control in the mixing process. But the problem with this is, again, that the sound arrives at slightly different times to each of those mics. So when you put them into Logic or whatever DAW you're using, they're going to be slightly misaligned, which can cause this destructive interference or this phase cancellation. So I've got an example here which I want to show you and how we can go about actually fixing this problem. So I've got a recording here which I did last year with a band, and what happened is that we've got our top snare and our bottom snare, but if you zoom in, so we're going to have to really zoom in here to see the waveform itself. So all the way in here, let's make that a little bit less. You can see right here, our troughs from our top snare recording are interacting with the peaks from the bottom snare recording. So they're playing at the same time, and when played together, they're going to cancel each other out in the sense that a lot of those frequencies are going to be lost and the snare is going to sound a lot weaker. So how do we go about fixing that? It's pretty simple. There's a couple of different ways. The first one I would say is just putting on the gain plugin in Logic if you're using Logic. But the main thing you want to do is use this phase invert button. So what this is going to do is it's going to flip the phase or invert it 180 degrees. So what that means is that the peaks are now going to be aligning with the peaks and the troughs are going to be aligning with the troughs. So they're going to be adding together instead and giving it a much more punchy and powerful sound. So you can see here, if I turn it on, it goes green. So that's how you do it there. Pretty simple. And what I want to do here is show you the difference if I play back the drums with the snares out of phase versus having them in phase. So let's give it a listen now. I'm going to start by playing it with them out of phase, and then I'm going to turn that phase invert on, which is going to put them in phase, and you'll hear that difference where it sounds much more punchy. So let's just listen to it here. And this is out of phase, and then I'll turn it on. And off. And on. On. Off. So you can hear a bit of a difference going on there, and it's not an obvious difference to be fair, But with some recordings, it's super obvious and it sounds a lot weaker before and a lot stronger after. And I think the more plugins I would have added to this, the stronger that sound becomes and the stronger that difference becomes. So originally, when you have just the raw recordings, it's not as much of a difference, but the more you start adding compression and things like that, you'll start to really hear that difference. So the second solution is also pretty simple. All you need to do is just time align these. So if we zoom in again and we go right to where the recordings are, we want to line up the peaks with the peaks and the troughs with the troughs. So right now it's not quite there. If I just move it slightly that way, all of a sudden you've got peaks lining up with peaks and troughs lining up with troughs. It's really that simple, but it's something that people often forget and overlook because they're focusing on all these other different things and these plugins and what they need to add and stuff like that. So the second scenario is when you've got multiple mics recording an acoustic guitar. So again, this is similar to that scenario I was talking about before, where you've got the mics at slightly different distances. You might have one recording, say, at the body or the whole of the guitar and one recording at the end of the neck. And that sound source is arriving at slightly different times. So you're going to have a little bit of phase cancellation. And the solution to fixing that is pretty much the same thing. You either want to invert the phase and see if it sounds fuller and more vibrant, or you want to slightly time align the recording itself so that you have them in line and that the peaks line up with the peaks, the troughs line up with the troughs. So when played back together or summed to mono, they're going to sound much more full and complete overall. And another technique is using a specific mic pattern that's designed to avoid phase cancellation. So you can either use an XY pattern or an ORTF pattern, and both of these techniques are designed to avoid that phase cancellation and get the recording to sound as full as it would in the actual room. So the third instance of when this might happen is when you're blending a DI signal of an electric guitar with an actual recorded amp signal. So again, it's the same problem as you've got with the other two. When you're recording in a DI, you've got an almost instant recording, whereas when you're recording with an amp and with a microphone mic'd up to an amp, it's just going to be slightly behind. So you're going to have those peaks and troughs that are slightly misaligned and causing that destructive interference. So the way to fix it, again, just time align them or invert the phase, see which sounds better and go from there. The fourth one is a more common one that happens with vocal recordings as well as guitar recordings, and this is when you're duplicating the exact same recording and panning it left and right. Now this is one I used to do all the time because I used to think that it's an easier way of doing double tracking and it can save you a bit of time instead of having to record the same thing over and over. And I soon realized that that was a significant issue, as when I played my tracks back in mono, they would actually disappear completely, those two double tracks, because I'd be duplicating the same thing and sometimes I'd be moving them slightly out of phase while I was doing that, and that was what was creating the problem. Or I'd be adding slightly different effects, and sometimes the effects themselves would also cause a bit of phase cancellation and maybe not cause the thing to disappear completely, but rather just cause a bit of destructive interference, which was still not ideal. So you need to be very careful if you're duplicating recordings. The best solution to this is just don't duplicate them at all and instead record that vocal twice and then pan each recording to the left and right. And that also gives it a much more natural and fuller feel overall, in my opinion. And this is the exact same for guitar recordings and that sort of thing as well. Okay, I just want to show an example of that now with guitars. So what I've done here is originally I had the left and right channels. So these were separate recordings. But what I've done is I've gone and duplicated the left recording and I've panned it equally. So 25 right, 25 left. And what's happening here is that because I've nudged it slightly to the side, I've put them directly out of phase. So this is what happens, say, if you're just messing around and you haven't really timed align things properly and you just it can happen at any moment. You could just be slightly moving things around and then all of a sudden, you can barely see it there, but there's a slight misalignment. And if we go back to here again, you can see that the troughs, it's not even quite there. We can move it even further so that right there, the peaks are aligning with the troughs. So again, it's a bit like that snare scenario, and it's going to cause some destructive interference. They're not going to cancel out completely in this case because you can see there's slightly different stuff going on. It might, we'll have a listen, but I haven't perfectly got it out of phase. But the point I want to put across here is that if they are slightly out of phase, this is going to cause a lot of issues with your sound. So let's just give it a listen, and I've got a plugin here which is called Adapter Metric AB, and I'm going to turn on the mono button, so I'm going to convert it from stereo into mono, and we're going to hear the difference in that guitar sound. So let's just give that a listen now. So this is in stereo, and then go to mono. You can hear it sounds very thin and hollow. And then back to stereo. So it's a really weird sound. It's a lot thinner because there's a bit of interference going on there, destructive interference that is, and it's not ideal. So basically the point I'm trying to get across is if you're recording guitars, record them as 2 separate layers. Don't try and duplicate stuff. It's just going to make things a lot more difficult and not sound as good in the end. So the 5th instance of where this can happen is using stereo effects, which kind of is counterintuitive because you think, oh, I'm using stereo effects, therefore it's going to make it more stereo and avoid these different phase cancellation issues. It's not going to be identical on each side. But what they can do is rather than cancelling out completely, it can cause, again, a bit of this destructive interference. So if you're using something like a widener and say you're using it on a recording on the left and a recording on the right, even though they're slightly different, that interaction is going to cause a lot more areas where they interact and cancel with each other between the 2 recordings. And that's the same for a chorus plugin as well, where in some cases it may create a delay which put things slightly out of time, and even just say 30 milliseconds will cause enough of an effect that it's going to cause destructive interference. And the final instance I want to talk about is when you're recording a vocal too close to a really solid wall. And what happens here is once you're singing into the mic, originally the recording is being recorded into the mic, but also you're getting those reflections that are coming off the wall, and they're coming back almost instantaneously into the mic as well. So the mic's recording your sound and it's recording those reflections, and that slight difference between those 2 sounds is what's causing this phase cancellation again. So it can be an issue, and it makes your vocal sound hollow and phasey, and it just has this strange feeling to it. So that's why people say you always want to record in a treated room or with the sound absorption materials around. So something like acoustic panels on the wall, and make sure there's a thick acoustic panels. You can have a reflective filter as well. It's not a perfect solution, but it definitely helps. And the last solution isn't necessarily a conventional one, but it does work if you don't have access to a treated room, and that's going to be recording in a cupboard like this one behind me with clothes in it, as clothes are a great absorption material for sound, and what they can do is reduce that reflection much more than just recording in, say, a room like this, like I am now. So to summarize, the tips for avoiding phase cancellation would basically be to check your track in mono, so always be checking throughout the mix or even at the end, and then you can go back and fix these things before you go to that mastering stage. And it's just a good habit to get into to make sure that your mix sounds just the same in mono as it would in stereo, and nothing's being cancelled out or sounding thin and hollow and phasey. The second one is checking those waveforms of both recordings. So if you're not sure, go back and actually zoom in and check the recordings, see if those peaks align with the troughs, and go from there. And the third scenario is to invert the phase. So if you haven't had time to do this sort of aligning with the peaks and troughs, you can simply just chuck on a gain plugin or a plugin that has a phase invert option, press that and see if it makes a difference, because sometimes that's all it takes to make the sound much more full and avoid that phase cancellation. So hopefully this idea of phase cancellation makes a lot more sense now, but again, if you do have any questions, do leave them in the comments below. I'm always happy to answer questions, and if you want to talk about things more and your own mixes and how we can get your own mixes to sound professional, I'll leave a link for a one-on-one call in the description. It's completely free, it takes half an hour, and we can just talk about what you need to do to help to get your mix to that next level. So it's just a little bit of free advice that I like to give out for people if they're looking for stuff, and especially if they're watching these videos, because obviously it helps me and it supports the channel when you're watching these videos and subscribed as well. So that's all for today. Hopefully that all helps, and I will see you in the next video.